Well, this morning we are continuing on in Hebrews chapter 11 in our series By Faith, and we're going to be taking a look at this list of the heroes of faith. And we have been in this chapter now for 6 weeks, and we have 2 sermons left in this message, or in this series, and culminating actually in chapter 12, verses 1 through 3, with the ultimate example of faith, in that of Jesus Christ. And today we're at the very last name on the list. And as I thought about Rahab this morning, many things rushed into my mind. I mean, she's a familiar character to me, and I've done Bible studies, and I've done character studies on Rahab, but she usually gets a pretty bad rap in sermons, and they focus on the scarlet thread and all, and Rahab was a bad lady, and God saves bad ladies even today, and things like that. And so I just wasn't content with that, because that's not what verses 29 through 31 speak to me. So let me read it to you again here, and then I need to give you a little bit of backstory just so you can understand why Rahab is the culminating example in this list of illustrations that are given to us, marked out by these words, by faith. And why a Canaanite, Amorite prostitute from 2,000 years ago, or 3,000 years ago actually, why her example is a great example and significant to each one of us today. But I have to do some work to show you why that is. So let me read to you this again, starting in verse 29. It's a transitional verse after we've looked at the life and the faith of Moses, to those who followed him first through the Red Sea, and then who entered the Promised Land under the leadership of Joshua. 29 through 31, it says this: By faith they passed through the Red Sea, as though they were passing through dry land. And the Egyptians, when they attempted it, were drowned. By faith the walls of Jericho fell down after they had been encircled for 7 days. By faith Rahab the harlot did not perish along with those who were disobedient, after she welcomed the spies in peace. Well, this is a portrait of life after Moses, isn't it? It's Moses' leadership being highlighted with that greatest example of God's salvation, the Exodus. The people being led out of Egypt into the Promised Land in this massive act of salvation where God opens the Red Sea and the people pass through. That generation, known as the wilderness generation, demonstrated faith when they walked through that water. And that would be the last time that they would demonstrate true faith. So what's happening here in this post-Moses generation is this group of faithless people who had to wait it out in the wilderness for 40 years, finally, after seeing their great leader Moses die without getting to enter that promised land, finally to see a mantle of his leadership being passed on to Joshua, and they see Joshua lead the people then into this Canaanite promised land. And I want you to see why this era would culminate with the faith of a Canaanite prostitute and what that has to do with your pressing on and enduring in the faith. And so we're going to take a look at the Bible in the book of Joshua. And that you might understand just what a momentous declaration it is for us to look at the life and faith of Rahab. Joshua chapter 1, the conquering of the Promised Land. On the page before, you actually find the death of Moses on display in your Bible. And so Joshua had really big shoes to fill, to say the least. The book of Joshua opens with the voice of God anointing and appointing the leadership of Joshua. This commander of the army, Joshua, son of Nun, Moses' servant and wingman, God says to him in verse 2, Joshua, my servant Moses is dead. Now therefore arise, cross this Jordan. I mean, 40 years they've been waiting for this moment. And now they will cross the Jordan and enter the lands that not even Moses was allowed to enter. And so God is commissioning Joshua, and Joshua had huge shoes to fill. But then comes the promise in verse 3. Every place in which the sole of your foot travels, in which the sole of your foot treads, I have given it to you, just as I've spoken to Moses. From the wilderness in this great Lebanon, as far as the East River, the Euphrates, all of the way to the Hittites, as far as the great sea, to the setting of the sun, will be your territory. Finally, the promise that God gave Abraham is being fulfilled in this moment for this young man. Joshua is now in charge of God's people. God has given a charge in verses 5 through 9. No man will be able to stand before you all the days of your life. Just as I have been with Moses, I will be with you. I will not fail you or forsake you. Be strong and courageous. You shall give these people possession of the land which I swore to their fathers. He repeats again, be strong and very courageous, careful to do according to the law which Moses, my servant, commanded you. Don't be alarmed or terrified, because the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. And then Joshua assumes command of the people. And then learning from the disaster of the Exodus account, where Moses took 12 men and sends them into the land as spies. Do you remember that back in Numbers? And they come back and they decide not to listen to God, saying, we're not going to follow God into the promised land. And God judges them for 40 years, consigned to wandering, the entire generation to die in the wilderness. Well, Joshua learns from that example and sends 2 men from Shittim as spies, saying, chapter 2, verse 1 now, go, look over the land, especially Jericho. So they went, and they came to this house of a harlot whose name was Rahab, and they lodged there. Someone told the king of Jericho, men from the Israelites have come here tonight to spy on this land. So the king of Jericho sent word to Rahab, send out the men who came to you, the ones who came into your house, because they have come to spy on the entire land. Well, at this point, we're actually aware of what's happening here, aren't we? The spies are entering into this fortified city. It's a city described in Deuteronomy as having walls that go all the way up to the heavens. And now the king of Jericho, he's sort of a mayor of this city, finds out that they are there. And then he sends word to Rahab, and he says, bring them to me. We found the spies. And Rahab makes a choice. Verse 4. But the woman had taken the 2 men and hidden them. And then she said, of course the men came to me, but I didn't know where they were from. The men left when it was time to close the gate at dark, but I don't know where these men went. Hurry, chase after them. You might catch up with them. But she had taken them up to the roof and hidden them under the flax stalks that she had laid out on the roof. And the men from Jericho chased after these guys into the direction of the Jordan up the fords. And as soon as they were chasing them and they went out, the gate was shut behind them. And then Rahab sets down terms. Before the spies get comfortable, Rahab went up to the 2 spies hiding on the roof. Wait a minute. Back up a second. Did Rahab just lie to the cops? Because I think she just lied to the cops. Not 1, but 3 times. She lies to the cops. You know, so many people focus on Rahab's lies here. And it gets into this huge theological debate on when or when it isn't ever okay to lie. But that is not the focus of the New Testament, ever. When it talks about Rahab, that is, it's never bringing up her lie again. It neither commended or condemned. You know, a friend says God is a God of truthfulness, not a God of lies. And when we focus on the lie that she told, I don't think we're talking about the real point of this story, because immediately verses 8 through 15 have a greater focus on Rahab's truth. Let's look at verse 8 again. Before the spies bedded down, Rahab went up to them on the roof. She said to the men, I know that the Lord has given you the land. Terror over you has overwhelmed us. The entire population of this land has melted down in fear because of you. We have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea in front of you when you left Egypt. We have also heard what you did to Sihon and Og, the two kings of the Amorites on the other side of the Jordan. You utterly wiped them out. We heard this, and our hearts turned to water. Because of you, people can no longer work up the courage. It is because the Lord your God is God in heaven above and on earth below. Now I have been loyal to you. So pledge to me by the Lord that you in turn will deal loyally with my family. Give me a sign of good faith. Spare the lives of my father, mother, brothers, and sisters, along with everything they own. Rescue us from death. And so the men said to her, we swear by our own lives to secure yours. If you don't reveal our mission, we will deal loyally and faithfully with you when the Lord gives us the land. So she lowered the spies down on a rope through the window. And note, her house was on the outer side of a city wall, and she lives inside the wall. And then she says to him, go towards the highlands. I mean, there is so much drama in this, I can't even tell you right now. Did you notice that the gate actually, remember the gate closed in verse 5? So these guys are now trapped inside. And the author, with so much drama and interesting storytelling ability, then he reveals that this brothel was actually in the wall of the city, providing these men a way of an escape. And she tells them, go towards the highlands, because Jericho was in the middle of a plain. And if you escape from Jericho, men on horses and archers, and they'd be able to overtake you so quickly. And they had to do this under cover of darkness. And as they leave, they reaffirm the oath, and they tell her in verse 18, unless when we come into the land, you tie a red woven cord in the window through which you lowered us. Gather your father and your mother and your brothers and your whole family into the house with you. Those who go outside the doors of your house into the street will have only themselves to blame for their own deaths. We won't be responsible. If anyone lays a hand on those who are with you in the house, we will take the blame for their death. But if you reveal our mission, we won't be responsible for this pledge you made us swear any longer. So she said, according to your words, so be it. And she sent them away, and they departed. And then she tied a scarlet cord in the window. And they return now to Joshua, and they give him this report. And the report is different from the original spies who went 40 years ago. Verse 24, which is not printed in your bulletin, says this: surely Yahweh has given all the land into our hands. Moreover, all the inhabitants of the land have melted away before us. Outside of the walls of the city is a people filled with faith. And now Israel would cross the Jordan in a miraculous way, just like the previous generation crossed the Red Sea. So they build a monument where the priests' feet were, in the middle of the Jordan, which was a high tide, by the way, according to verse 15 of chapter 3. And they set up this memorial there. And the water crashes back, and they've crossed, and there is no returning. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? Moses? And then we need to skip ahead a bit. Now Joshua is forming this plan, and he's planning a battle against this massive walled city of Jericho. And God speaks to him and tells him how he's going to proceed. And the instructions he's given are nothing less than ridiculous, right? You have heard it in Sunday school, most of you, and you know the walls of Jericho. What do they do according to the song? They come a-tumbling down, don't they? Right, they come a-tumbling down with those familiar words. And it's a Bible story that many of us actually know. And so they blow the trumpet in chapter 6, and I want to pick up the story in verse 15 of chapter 6. On the 7th day, they get up at dawn, and they circled the city 7 times. And then on the 7th time, the priests blew the trumpets, and Joshua said to the people, "Shout, because the Lord has given you the city. And the city and everything in it is to be utterly wiped out as something reserved for the Lord. Only Rahab the prostitute is to stay alive, along with everyone in her house. This is because she hid the messengers we sent. But you, keep away from the things that are set aside for God, because so you don't desire and take some of these things that are reserved. All the silver and the gold, along with the bronze and the iron equipment, are holy to the Lord. They must go into the Lord's treasury." You see, the people weren't supposed to get rich from this. It was all supposed to go to the Lord. The destruction of this people and all of their riches that they had stolen from God's people being in their rightful place. And so the priests blew the trumpets, and when they heard the sound of the trumpet, the people shouted with great shout, and the wall fell down flat. And the people went into the city, and they captured it. And now listen carefully. Without mercy, they utterly destroyed everything in the city, both man and woman, young and old, cattle and sheep and donkeys at the edge of a sword. And then Joshua spoke to the 2 spies, and he said, "Go to Rahab's house. Bring her out from there, along with everyone related to her, exactly as you pledged to her." You know, folks, somehow this one piece of wall has not fallen down. In the ruins of this city, her apartment, her little brothel, has remained intact. And so all those also who stayed inside are saved. So this young man who had been spies, or these young men rather, who had been spies and went and brought Rahab out along with her father and her mother and her brothers and everyone related to her, they brought her whole clan out. And they let them stay outside Israel's camp. They burned the city and everything in it, but they put the silver and the gold, along with the bronze and iron equipment, into the treasury of the Lord's house. So now let's go back quickly to Hebrews 11. The story of Rahab, and the reason that I drag you through so much of Joshua, if you study Hebrews 11 like we've been studying, you see that little phrase, "by faith." And it's led us into these significant illustrations that we've been given. That phrase, "by faith," it has been given to us in chronological order from the Old Testament. And these Jewish background believers who first heard this sermon read to them were very aware of the Old Testament. And in fact, they were considering walking away from Christ and going back into temple worship. So they knew the Old Testament, and it was all this Christianity stuff that was causing them so much trouble. And so these examples are drawn from their own spiritual history for a very specific purpose, so that these people who are hearing these words would persevere, and they wouldn't turn their back on Christ, that they wouldn't go back to their former way of living. And so he tells them, by faith, Abel. And they knew Abel, and he's in Genesis, and he's the son of Adam and Eve. And he tells them, by faith, Enoch. And they knew Enoch walked with God, and they knew who was going to come next. By faith, Noah. And it's all very predictable. And then comes Abraham and his wife Sarah by association. And then who would go next? Well, obviously, the sons of Abraham, Isaac and Joseph. And Joseph would preserve the people of Egypt. And then who would lead the people out of Egypt? By faith, Moses. So it makes perfect chronological sense. Abel and Enoch, Noah, Abraham, Esau, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, Moses. Now the walls of Jericho fall down by faith, and there's only one more name that would make sense on this list like this, and one name that would actually fit into this great spiritual lineage. And if you're doing the list of by faiths, who do you think should go next? Joshua, right? And after hearing these most significant names, to hear the captain of the conquest, Joshua, lived by faith, makes perfect sense. The successor of Moses, the one appointed by the commander, of Yahweh himself. But instead, we get an Amorite prostitute. Do you see how stunning this is? The people would have expected for their ears to hear by faith Abraham, by faith Isaac, by faith Jacob and Joseph and Moses, by faith the walls, by faith Rahab? What? Rahab is placed on this list instead. She's the culminating name on this list of Israel's faithful. And after he says Rahab, he just rattles off names and he doesn't illustrate them anymore. Verse 32, he says, "What more shall I say?" And then it's just a rapid survey. He intends for us to pay close attention to Rahab's faith, because ultimately our faith depends on being like Rahab's faith. In this, her obedient faith saved her from destruction. And so it's a message of perseverance, and it's crystal clear. The author is still saying the same thing he said from the start. Don't draw back. Don't drift away. Your commitment to Christ must stand the test of time. It must endure faithful trials. It must endure persecutions. Your faith must stay the course. So listen to the faith of Rahab, because your perseverance depends on it. Now, do you remember what we read in Joshua chapter 2, the truth of Rahab? It was all about this. It was all about what she had heard. We heard how the Lord, Yahweh, dried up the sea. We heard what you did to the kings Sihon and Og, who you utterly destroyed. We heard this. And so she claims allegiance to Yahweh. So in the brothel, the Egyptians would come in, and they would talk about what Israel's God had done. And in the brothel, people and travelers and merchants from all over the ancient world would speak about the God of Israel. And one of those prostitutes heard it. And she listened, and she believed in an unseen God. And that made all the difference. God chose Rahab. And then we get to her actual deliverance in Joshua chapter 6. And what do we see here? God rescues her household. She was a foreigner. She was a prostitute, and she was richly unclean. So she had to actually remain outside the camp looking in. But eventually, how many have read the book of Ruth? Anybody? Because I love this part. Rahab would eventually be welcomed into the camp as a convert to Judaism. And she would marry into a family called the family of Nahshon. And his son's name was Salmon. And that name might be familiar to you because the genealogy that closes the book of Ruth then says Rahab marries Salmon. And they had a son, and his name was Boaz, a man of great character who didn't hesitate to welcome a foreign Midianite woman named Ruth into his family because he remembered who his mother, Rahab, was. And then those same names, Rahab and Ruth and Obed and David, would be in the genealogy of Jesus Christ. What a story. What a destiny is the life of faith when God saves you by faith from destruction and welcomes you to join Jesus and receive faith's ultimate reward. Let's pray. God, we thank you. We thank you for your grace, matchless and marvelous grace. Every one of us, we have been forgiven and accepted and welcomed outside the walls of the city. And now we're part of your family, God. We thank you for the commendation of Rahab's faith and works today, and may we follow her in like manner as she follows Jesus, our ultimate example of faithfulness. In Jesus' name, amen.